why do we think that the path to love is knowing more when it seems like the path to power is knowing more, and that power, that control, is actually anti-loving according to the Jesus-shaped love that I want to pursue?
This is Down to Earth Conversations, where we hear from ordinary people who are helping to bring a bit of heaven down to earth. Kia ora, welcome to another episode of Down to Earth Conversations. I'm your host, Andy Dixon, and it's a pleasure to have you along for this episode, whether it's your first or your 53rd. This is a podcast where I talk to people who are making a difference in the world in some way, or as I like to say, people who are bringing a bit of heaven down to earth. For those who aren't aware, each episode finishes with a karakia, or a prayer, which is in Te Reo Māori, the language of Māori who are the indigenous people here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The karakia is what's commonly known as the Lord's Prayer, and I end with it simply because at its heart, the prayer expresses a desire that heaven would be found on earth, and that's something that I'm all about. I was honoured to have the chance to talk to today's guest, Byas, who has been someone I've listened to and learned from for a number of years now. I first became aware of Jared through the podcast that he runs with his friend Pete Enns, called The Bible for Normal People. They've been having conversations with all sorts of amazing guests for years, bringing a diverse group of voices together and covering a wide range of content with the aim of helping people explore the Bible, sometimes in ways that they might not have ever thought about doing before. I've since read some of Jared's writing, including his latest, Jonah for Normal People, which I 100% recommend. It's easy to read, it's short, but it's hugely helpful in demonstrating how to read certain kinds of texts while letting go of the demands that some of us were taught we had to place on the text. We talk about that in this conversation today. We also talk about what drove Jared's faith to shift and what he sees differently now from the Christianity that he grew up with. We talk about his books, the podcast, of course, and also his Choctaw Nation heritage and how that shapes how he sees the world. This is episode 53 of Down to Earth Conversations. Here's Jared Byas. Welcome to the podcast, Jared Byas.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, a number of our listeners will have heard of you, but some of them won't. So do you want to just give us a little bit on who you are, where you're from? Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I live just north of Philadelphia and was a pastor for a number of years as well as a professor, and then started the podcast, The Bible for Normal People. I almost said The Bible for Normal Pete, because he's not that normal. We're trying to normalize him.
Yeah.
But The Bible for Normal People with Pete Enns. And so that's what I've been doing since. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
And what was your kind of faith background growing up?
Yeah, so that's a little more complicated than what I just shared. Grew up in Texas as a Southern Baptist and also charismatic, so kind of equal parts of each one of those. And then went to Liberty University. And I kind of skipped a step there because later in high school, I recognized that my faith, I gravitated more toward the intellectual side. And so at least in my area of Texas, that really lent itself more toward Presbyterianism. So I became Reformed Presbyterian, then went to Liberty, which is affiliated with the Southern Baptists, and studied philosophy. And then my faith started shifting, just studying philosophy. And then went to seminary at Westminster Seminary up here, right near Philadelphia, which I'd wanted to do since I was in high school. And that's more Reformed, kind of Presbyterian affiliated. And then my faith really shifted there. I went to get a PhD in apologetics, which is how to defend your Christianity, defend your beliefs. Really, it's how to argue well with atheists, basically. And within a semester, my faith shifted a lot from what I was learning and what I was experiencing in seminary, and I ended up switching over to biblical studies. And then that led me to, instead of being a professor right away, I became a pastor for a number of years in a non-denominational kind of evangelical megachurch kind of environment. And then that's my faith kind of continued to shift throughout that time and culminated in me, getting resigned from that church And then I was a professor for a while where I could more freely kind of explore what do I actually believe without my paycheck depending on it. And that kind of is what led to the formation of the Bible for all people.
Because that is a big deal for some pastors, isn't it? That you've got to keep believing what your church believes, or your paycheck is at risk.
Yeah, and I don't even think it's really conscious. I think it's often subconscious that you don't even allow yourself to go there because you kind of under the surface realize all these things are at stake, whether it's relationships, paychecks, networks, community, a lot.
One of your recent guests was another New Zealander, actually, David Farrier,
Yep.
talking about the megachurch space. And so, what was your kind of experience of being in that space, and then looking back on that and going, were there things that were really healthy, things that were really unhealthy? What was that like for you?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I think sometimes when I talk to people and they're maybe more progressive, they'll joke about, "Hey, how was your time at Liberty?" And by and large, I'm like, "It was a good experience. Like I had a pretty good experience with it." And I would say similar to being at the church when I first got there, there was a reason I was attracted to it. That was my style of church, and a lot of good things happened. I just think that there was just a lot of dysfunctional leadership and also just my beliefs shifted so that it just was incompatible on some level at some point. And when I started seeing that those beliefs were hurting people and excluding people, I think that was the one thing, and I think it does expand out into a lot of mega churches, is there's this facade of inclusivity. All are welcome here. It's a place for everyone to belong. Like these are the catchphrases, but they don't realize that there's an asterisk there. Restrictions do apply. And often the very people who need the restrictions not to apply are the ones who get left out. And I did not like that at all.
Yeah, interesting. Actually, as you say that, I'm thinking actually that you could take out the word megachurch and just put in church, and that,
Right.
I mean, it's not just
Yep.
megachurches; it's across the board that we all get a way of, I guess, thinking what we think and believing what we believe, and often we don't realize how that impacts other people. Yeah. So, what was that journey like for you and your family when you started realizing that things were shifting, that this was no longer compatible? Was that like a what the heck God kind of moment, or was it like yay a new adventure, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I don't know. I've never been one to be like, "Oh no, God, what's happening?" It is more, okay, let's take a deep breath and let's reframe it. Let's see what it's like to think of it as an adventure. And it precipitated us moving across the country when we had just had I think my daughter was 3 months old, and we moved across the country so I could go teach. And we had two other kids who were 3 and 2, so we had 3, 2, and a newborn. And yeah, we packed up all our stuff and moved across the country. And it was, it's also actually it's funny that you say that because it just gave me a memory. Whenever a pastor leaves at our church, they would, have a special service, not a special service, but a special part of the service and thank you. And anybody who wants to come say their goodbyes could come. I would, stood at the front and people would come up. And one of the people, many of the people, and this is maybe me being a little, um, I think when our faith shifts, oftentimes we get more, we're more explicit. We have a little rougher edges. We feel the need to kind of say things out loud that, to help kind of establish us. I think just the edges are a little rougher. Life hasn't maybe smoothed them out over the years. And so when you're kind of, you just have that kind of fire in the belly about this thing, whatever it happens to be, like this new belief that I hold. So I think I was a little bit, rougher than I needed to be. But somebody came up and said something like, "Well, we're really going to miss you, Pastor Jared, but we know God has a great plan for you." And basically painted a picture like it was not my choice to leave. What were we all to do? God wanted me to leave, and so that's what's happening. And given the circumstances, I did have a lot to say in it. And so I actually, in that moment, I said, I actually, and again, it may be wrong of me, not the right time to like say this, but I just kind of said, well, actually, I'm making this choice. Like, I think it's time for me to move on. There was a lot of things going on that just there's incompatibilities, and I think I wish everyone well, but let's not blame God for me leaving. And she was like very taken aback. But again, I think it was me trying to take responsibility for these things in my life, because I think for a lot of these big decisions, it is a like, God, what are you doing? It's like, well, what did other people do? What did I do? Like, what's the circumstance here? And that doesn't negate the theological implications. I was just talking to someone the other day about, when we talk about the split in the Hebrew Bible between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The Bible has two different. There's a geopolitical reason for that, and then there is a theological reason for that, and we have the same with the exile. There is a political reason, like, well, Babylon's coming in and they're just wiping everyone out. That's not like, it's not magic. The superpowers coming in and taking you out. But then there's a theological reason. Well, it's also because you are not following the Deuteronomic code. You're not following the law of God, and you're going to be punished because Deuteronomy says if you don't follow the law, you're going to be punished. And so this is how it is. And so we have to, I think, as Christians, grapple with that. Those are not either or biblically. Those can be both and. There can be, I did choose to leave. And I think we just have to, I needed to do a better job. And I think a lot of Christians could do a better job just taking responsibility for the choices we make, or at least seeing that there are a lot of factors at play in the things that happen in the world. It's not always magic.
Yeah, I think, I mean, going back to my own experience of being made redundant when I was an associate pastor. So I didn't choose to leave, but I still was trying to say to people, actually, like, because people had this idea that, well, if the elders had decided that, then that was the will of God,
right?
And I was like, oh, do you know what? I think the elders decided that because they, in their prayer and in their, they're trying to do the best they can, came to the decision that that was the best thing,
right?
And that is their decision. And so my take on it was, actually, I think the will of God is not should Andy go or should Andy stay, but that the decision is made in the heart of, what's the best for people, and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, people struggled with that, and also people had a real want to compare things, and so I got a lot of, there's something better coming, and it's like, why does it have to be better? Actually, there's been a whole lot of amazing stuff about this last season. I'm not going to compare them. That was what it is. This is what it is. But yeah, again, people just feel like they need to say something to make it better, maybe, or I don't know. It just, yeah. A lot of the times we don't have the theology that will hold up this awkward moment.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say, and you said it better. I think we lack the theological language to handle disappointment, and tragedy, and things not working out. And so we only have one script, and it's a script that doesn't fit those circumstances.
Yeah. Yes. So you're shifting faith, especially what you were saying about noticing that people were excluded. Is that the sort of stuff that then led to you writing your book, Love Matters More?
The Love Matters More was a culmination of my whole experience within more of a fundamentalist evangelical tradition, where what I noticed as I got older, and I hope wiser, but definitely softer, I started to recognize that the Bible paints the goal of the Christian life to be love. And I had always been taught implicitly that the goal of the Christian life is actually to know more than anyone else. It was to be right. That was the goal. We would say it was love, but when I started to actually look back at the practices, the programs, the services, the systems, the people we put in leadership, the people we put in front, it was all about privileging a head knowledge about Jesus or about God or about theology. I was kind of a jerk when I was younger, but I kept being invited to speak at things. I kept being, like, even as a teenager, I was asked to lead adult Bible studies. Because why? What qualification did I have? I was articulate, and I was smart, and I knew the ABC of theological discourse. That's why I got it. And so the whole system was skewed to being right. And then that was the internal, and then the external was we have this culture war going on, and the best way to win the culture war is to be right. Like, so when someone comes to you and says, why don't you listen to, explicit lyric music, or why don't you watch rated R movies? Like, I had to be able to, I needed to know the right answer. That was the key. And so, and then on the flip side of that, I started seeing that the people who I thought who best mirrored or modeled the gospel were not being promoted. They were not being put up front. And I just felt like that was a complete reversal of what Jesus was about. And so that started my own journey of looking inward at me and all of the ways that I had hurt people through my life by trying to be right, by trying to get ahead. And frankly, it doesn't even have to be that nefarious. It really often was because I did think that was the loving thing to do. The loving thing to do was to convince people they were wrong, because at the end of the day, if you're wrong about some things, you spend eternity in hell. And so it's really important that you get it right.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was even thinking of, in my growing up in the same kind of evangelical world, even evangelism was about, hey, they don't know the right stuff. We know, so we're all good, but we need to make sure they know. Like, now, I look back at some of the stuff that we got taught in terms of how to go and approach complete strangers, and I just cringe, because it's like, well, oh man, let's go and, first of all, let's trick them into having a conversation with me by pretending it's not about Christianity. And now that we've tricked them, now let's tell them that they're horrible people and that we've got the answers. It's like, oh man, that's pretty arrogant. Yeah. So you went on, like you say, to be part of the Bible for Normal People with Pete Enns. How did that actually come about?
Well, it started 10 years ago now, actually, right 10 years ago, when we published Genesis for Normal People together. So I was teaching, Pete was teaching, I was teaching out in Arizona, he was teaching here in Pennsylvania, and he reached out about a book that he had some notes on, but it wasn't finished, and would I help? And I said, yeah, if we can co-author it, let's do that. And so we started working on this book together, and we published it, Genesis for Normal People. And then fast forward 3 years later, I had moved back to Pennsylvania at that point.
Did you know each other before that?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Pete was my professor at Westminster.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. So we had connected there, and we had gone through similar experiences. He was getting resigned from his position at Westminster at the same time I was leaving the church. So we were wrestling in some practical existential ways together of like, what does this mean for our paycheck? Like, we can't do anything else. Like, this is like what we're trained to do. What do you do if you can't do this? And if our beliefs are shifting, will we find a place that are going to find these things acceptable? Like, where do you go? And so we were really wrestling with that. That was kind of the catalyst of our friendship. And then that's what led to a few years later writing Genesis for Normal People together. And then a few years later, starting the podcast, because I think we both have a heart for two things. Well, we have an interest in biblical scholarship. I think we're both just so curious, and for whatever reason, our personalities are bent toward learning about all that stuff. But I think we have a real heart for teaching people and helping people understand what it is that we've learned. That's all we're doing is passing along what we learned. And so that's really all came together in the Bible for Normal People.
You basically sounds like you're telling my story in some ways, because I've done the theology training and biblical studies and loved it, and you have those moments. I don't know, maybe it's just that I'm an Enneagram 5, but I have those moments where something that you're studying or something that someone tells you just unlocks something, and it's like, oh my goodness, everybody has to know this. And so then I start telling people, and they're like, oh yeah, cool. It's like, no, you don't get it. This changes the whole world. But yeah, which is, I guess I love what you guys do, because you're putting it out there, and people can take it or not or whatever. But yeah, I mean, you've had over 1 million downloads on the podcast, so obviously people are listening. Mm-hmm. What do you love most about it?
I love ultimately what I really love is the community. And that's why I love hearing stories from people, and then to see more and more churches crop up where this open-handed theology. All theology has an adjective, but that doesn't threaten us, like it doesn't threaten who we are. A true inclusivity. These churches are cropping up more and more, and to be able to see pastors finding congregations who follow that line of thinking, and congregations to find pastors, and people finding each other, and that community part truly is important to me in a way that I didn't think it would be when we started. So it's been a little bit of a surprise as well.
Yeah, cool. You mentioned just then all theology has an adjective. Do you want to explain a little bit about that? Because it's one of the kind of the key parts of the behind the scenes stuff of the podcast.
Yeah, I mean it's a kind of I would say hermeneutical, which is just a way of saying how we interpret the Bible, principle, which is to say that all theology has an adjective, and that comes from when we were in seminary, and probably for most of the last few hundred years, when you're going to do theology, they would have classes, and it would be like African American theology, it would be feminist theology. But then whenever you did like white European, man theology, there was no adjective. It wasn't like white European theology. That no seminary had a course called white European theology. That was just called Theology 101. And so just recognizing our own social location, and realizing that what we grew up thinking was objective, once for all, absolute truth theology was actually coming from a particular context. And it's, why do we privilege that and call it theology with no adjective? And then we have African American theology. Well, you could do like the real theology, or you could do like African American theology. And realizing all theology has an adjective. It all comes from a certain context. It all comes from, theology is the conversation of who we are in our particularity as it intersects with who God is. And you can't help but then have that be colored by your particular context.
Yeah. I interviewed someone a few episodes ago who's Māori and is doing some study into Māori and Pacifica theology, or particularly like Christian, like looking at how their Māoriness and the Pacifica kind of area influences how they interpret scripture and stuff. And so I made a point of saying on that episode, I want to talk to you about Indigenous theology, but not as opposed to ordinary theology,
Right.
It's so easy when you're in that space, particularly as a white male, like I am, to not even notice that that's a reality. But yeah, you guys talk a lot about decentering yourselves. What does that mean for you, and what does it actually look like in practice?
Well, one, it came from a fundamental realization of that all theology does have an adjective. If you don't believe that, it's going to be very hard to decenter whatever your particular context is. It's going to be hard to decenter it because you honestly think it's just the way it is. So why would you decenter it? That makes no sense. So first, I think it's coming to that humility that we don't have a grasp on absolute truth, which is, I know, a big ask for a lot of people. It's scary and it's humbling, and of course people think it's not true, but I would differ on that. And so I think that's one thing that is required, is a deep humility about what we know and what we don't know, based on who we are in our location and our context. So we talk a lot about context, and I think that's an important part of it. And then secondly, after that recognition, it's making sure that we are getting input and output from other sources than just the ones that reinforce our position in our context. So for us, that means making sure we have a wide diversity of people who do theology from their particular context, and in a way that's not comparative to systematic theology as it's been taught in the West. It just let it stand, let it be what it is, and let those voices come alongside what you've heard, challenge what you've heard, maybe reinforce it at times, but let that be a conversation amongst a diverse group of voices, rather than oftentimes if you look at the syllabus of a seminary, it will be all white dudes.
Yeah.
everything you read, everything you interact with. And that's just not true. It doesn't have integrity for what's actually going on in the world.
And I love that you guys quite openly learn things during the podcast. That someone will say something, you're like, oh wow, I've never thought of that. Actually, I just listened to the one yesterday while I was running about archaeology and toilets. And Pete going, oh, I've never thought of Jesus going to the toilet.
Yeah.
Wow. And I mean, that's not like going to change your theological worldview, but there was some awesome stuff in that episode that went, oh man, they are in a time and place, and the world was different, and I can't just read that how I want. And yet, one thing I love about what you do is that, as well as going the stuff that I've heard over the years of, we've got to get back into the original context. We've got to get, which is super important. And I've really valued that. And my master's thesis was all based around the few hundred years before Jesus and figuring out what they thought eternal life was and all that kind of stuff, and which I just buzzed out on, and a whole lot of people are rolling their eyes right now. But one thing you do is go, actually, we have to be aware of our own context as well, and that actually the way that we believe things and what's gone on in the past few hundred years actually influences how we do it as well. Do you want to just comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's just recognizing that when we say we have to learn the original context, we don't learn in some abstract way.
Yeah.
We learn as 21st century blank, blank, blank. Fill in the blanks with your particular adjectives. That is our social location. It is our context. And how we learn, the filter that I'm learning through is that filter. I'm going to pick up on I'm going to emphasize certain things. I'm going to, kind of selective listening. Like that's not that important. This is really important based on my experiences and based on my context. And the only way we can, we just have to be aware of that first. And if we're not, we're going to be directed in a certain way, and we're not going to realize it. And I think that's the dangerous part, is when we have this once for all universal absolute truth idea. And guess what? I tend to always have it in some sense. The people who espouse absolute truth as this thing are often the ones that say that they have it.
Yeah, right.
And so there's just no space there to become aware of our own filters. And I think that's incredibly important, because we don't read the Bible in 21st century America or New Zealand the way that they would have read it in 16th century France, or the way that St. Augustine would have read it in 4th century North Africa. Those are different contexts, and we can't help it. So I think we have to get out of this mindset that somehow one day we're going to overcome it. The only way we overcome it is when we're not human, because we can't transcend our context, unfortunately.
Has your philosophy training background been a huge part of that for you?
Oh, so yeah, very helpful. Absolutely. To see because philosophers are good at that. They're good at sort of pointing out the context that we find ourselves in. So they're not getting lost in the weeds, kind of pick up your head. Do you see kind of the big picture of what we're doing here? And that's been incredibly helpful.
One thing I've also picked up listening to the podcast is that, you talk about, being white male or whatever, but you're also Choctaw.
Yeah.
How much connection do you have to your Choctaw heritage? Is it something it's always been a part of life, or is it something you've thought about more recently? What's that been like?
It's complicated. It's definitely always been a part of my life. My grandmother's very Choctaw, and my mom very proud to be Choctaw. My grandmother and mom lived there, at the Choctaw Nation on the lands. And so it's always been a part, but it's weird growing up in an environment where it's almost like be proud of this at home, but we don't talk about it too much outside of that, because it's not always acceptable. And so it's sort of like, basically, my parents wanted me to have the most successful life I could have, and being Choctaw isn't one of those things that you want to really highlight if you're going to be as successful as you can be. And so it was a weird thing for me I feel like it wasn't ever explicit to like hide that, but it just felt implicit. And then as an adult, I would say in the last 10 years, recognizing I can be proud of it and talk about it and feeling free to do that has been very liberating, but it also has, yeah, it has some weird feelings attached to it as well. Um, and being someone who's not, fully Choctaw, also wanting to respect, well, what is my space as someone who's very, who easily passes as someone who's just a white man. I want to be respectful of that too. So it's been very complicated for me, but I would say it definitely has been a part of my culture, and I want that to continue, and I want my kids to understand that from a young age and be more feel free to be more proud of that, I think.
As you've gone through that last 10 years of going, actually, I can be proud of this, is it something that's affected your theology at all?
Yeah, 100%. And it's been a good. That's also been helpful because it allows where I am in my faith, I have more flexibility to allow it to influence my faith. And I think that's a really helpful thing. So, I mean, particularly the creation myths in the Choctaw, our Choctaw history has been, I've found a lot of connection to those creation myths, and just the respect for land, and these things have definitely shifted my faith in a much more the interconnectedness of all things. Like these kind of themes that you'll get in Choctaw and Native in general understandings of the world will have definitely influenced how I practice my faith.
Mm. As I've experienced more of Māori culture, I've realised that actually that their way of understanding the world is actually a lot more similar to the authors of the Bible than my white Western heritage. And I'm proud of my white Western heritage, but it's also going, hey, actually, I think you've got something here that helps unlock stuff for me. And then, of course, I'm trying not to, just colonize it, because
Right.
we've already done that a million times. And we don't want to keep doing that. But yeah, like you say, it's got that unlocking of the creation myths, and when we say myths, some of our listeners will be going, actually, what do you mean by that term? Do you want to explain a little bit like how you see that?
Yeah, so in academic circles, I think in common language, we talk about myths and we oppose those to facts. So it's like, it's a fact or is it a myth? But it's much more nuanced in literature to talk about myth as a meaning-making story for a particular culture or society. So a myth it could be true. It could have parts that are true. It could be completely fabricated. That doesn't really speak to what a myth is. It is this important story that has a lot of meaning. It continues to bring meaning to a culture or a society. And it's one of the reasons why, for instance, when you go to a church in 2022 in Alabama, USA, you might hear someone preach on Genesis 1 or Genesis 2 in this meaningful way. That's because it's a myth. It still gives meaning. And so oftentimes there's other characteristics to a myth in terms of not completely like historically situated. There's other components to it. And so I'm not also saying, it's not one or the other. It's just a category for literature that doesn't really tell us whether something happened or didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was one of the things that I wrestled with for years, going, actually, I've been told to take this stuff literally, but it doesn't kind of seem like I should be, but how does that fit with what they were trying to say? And I've probably told the story on the podcast before, but I heard a Māori guy, he got asked a question about, like, do you guys actually believe all that stuff? Those old myths and, from your culture. And one of the ones in his particular iwi, his tribe, was that they reached Aotearoa, they reached New Zealand on the back of the birds. That there's a story about them coming here on the back of the birds. And like, do you actually believe that? And he was like, well, what literally happened? Well, probably my ancestors followed the flight path of the birds because they knew that if they were flying somewhere, there had to be land eventually. So they probably did that. So did we come here on the back of the birds? Yeah, sure.
Right.
I was like, oh my goodness, that makes so much sense. That it's true. Being true and being literal aren't the same thing.
Right.
And containing truth and the entire story being factually accurate, that's not the same thing.
Right.
Yeah. Which brings me to another important part of your recent journey, and that's the book of Jonah, which again is one of these did it happen, did it not kind of things within church culture. You've recently released a book called Jonah for Normal People, a guide to the most misunderstood prophet of the Bible. Of all the things that you could have chosen to write about, why Jonah?
Well, almost for the exact thing we just talked about. To recognize Jonah was a flashpoint for this conversation when I was growing up. When I heard sermons on Jonah, it was almost always an attempt to defend or justify the historicity of the account of a man named Jonah getting swallowed by a whale, to defend God's honor that God can do miraculous things. And those liberals who are trying to tear down everything in our culture are going to tell you that it didn't actually happen, and here's why we think it did. And as though that was some important point to make. And for me, my faith, the way I understand the Bible and the way I understand faith and just culture in general, is that that's not the case. We don't treat anything else in literature the way we treat the Bible. No one's saying, Tolkien, hey, if that didn't actually happen, what good is it? If Bilbo didn't actually go on this journey, why are we even talking about it? But we make that case with the Bible for some reason, in an effort, I think, to be right and to talk about it in a certain way. We actually undermine the value of the Bible. Because for me, I missed so much opportunity to learn valuable lessons about life from the Bible because my eye was taken off that ball and put onto the most important thing is to get down into the weeds about how you can defend the historicity and literalness of this text. And so Jonah is just a nice, small, brief entry point into that conversation. How can something be true and not historically accurate?
Yeah.
And I think it's an important conversation because if you don't have a category for that, I think you're going to miss a huge amount of meaning and substance from the Bible.
In the book you write, when interpreters decide beforehand what a biblical book can or can't be, it can be difficult to see the text for what it is, which kind of highlights what you were just saying, but just tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, yeah, again, when we this all comes for full circle with what we were talking about earlier about context. So I came to the Bible already formed, probably from my mother's womb. That's overstatement, but it is like coming out into the world. I came with a preconceived idea that I got inherited from my tradition, my parents, that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God, can contain no mistakes, the guide for all things, not just for life and salvation, but historical, scientific, medical, technological. It is the grounding for everything that's true in the world. And that's a particular way of viewing the Bible. And so I already came to the text with a strong conviction that nothing in the text could contradict that framework. Not only that, let's go down even further where there were these more nuanced assumptions that were made around these reading strategies, I'll call them. So for instance, one of those reading strategies was you want to read your Bible in the most miraculous way you can. So you want to highlight when you can the miracles of God, that God does extraordinary things outside of the normal course of how the world works, because it displays God's power and it also helps you feel like you're right, like you can defend certain things in certain ways. And so my favorite example of this is in the Exodus story, where the Bible actually says that there was an east wind that came to separate the Yom Suf, the Reed Sea or the Red Sea, But if, and I used to do this because I thought it was funny, I would point that out. I would just say, well, God's hands didn't come down and separate the Red Sea. That was just the east wind. And the amount of vitriol and the amount of anger I would get because I am, you are just you're anti-supernaturalist. You're just trying to take all the miracles out of I'm like, it literally just says it. It says it in the Bible. So I think that's a great example where the framework almost crowds out the Bible itself, because it says, even if it says it in the text, we have like this cognitive dissonance because we've been programmed to see what the Bible is and then made the Bible fit into what we were told that it had to be.
I mean, that links to one of the other quotes that stood out to me from the book, where you said, perhaps figuring out what God is up to in the world isn't as simple as we were led to believe. Perhaps these books, and you're talking about Jonah, Ecclesiastes, and Job, are honest in their mystery. I guess what's your experience of embracing the mystery side of reading the Bible, and how has that changed things for you?
I think it's tied to that humility piece. I think there's two things. One, it's tied to the humility, where it's okay not to know everything, which I think is such an important piece to get to in a faith journey, because it allows you to explore deep questions, come to new understandings. So that humility piece, I think, is big. But I think the second piece was a shift in my faith to the practical instead of the factual. If faith isn't just about getting all the facts right, but it's actually about how we live our life, I found not only can books like Job and Ecclesiastes be an engine for action, for loving my neighbor in better and more nuanced and more understanding ways, it might actually be a better engine than some of those other ways that I've gone about it. Because again, if not to get too philosophical, but if we think knowledge is power, and so if we're resting our faith on what we know, that's leading to this power, where the Jesus-shaped narrative is about how love is decentering and it's giving up the power. And so why do we think that the path to love is knowing more, when it seems like the path to power is knowing more, and that power, that control, is actually anti-loving according to the Jesus-shaped love that I want to pursue? And so the mystery actually facilitates breaking away from that fact-based faith toward an action-based, love-based faith, in my experience.
Which I find fascinating, because it's not that you've then gone, oh, well, so I don't need to keep reading the Bible. Actually, you've still got a life that's dedicated to Scripture and to understanding, but with a whole lot of different tools and a whole lot of different outcomes than maybe what it was for you in the past.
Yeah, because maybe the goal isn't understanding. We need understanding. And that's where I think people get, when I wrote Love Matters More, I got a lot of feedback of like, well, you don't care about truth. It's like, you missed the whole point. So that's why it's called Love Matters More, not Love Matters Only. Like,
yeah.
We still need the understanding. But if understanding is the goal, then we I think run afoul of not keeping love at the forefront. But if love is the goal, and coming back to mystery again, if understanding is the goal, mystery is in opposition to that. But if love is the goal, then mystery can be a facilitator of that. And it doesn't actually understand, continually trying to understand so that I can love better, feels to me to be a fuller and more loving path than get to the understanding and somehow that magically just turns into loving action. I don't know how it works, but I just trust, that if I just read my Bible 100 times, I'm going to be a more loving human being. It's like, that makes no sense to me.
And it makes no sense to the people who aren't feeling loved by you interacting with them either.
Right.
I find that really fascinating that, like you say, if it's all about knowing, if it's all about proving others wrong, then, they're left feeling not loved. And so what is the fruit of that? And that's been one of the huge shifting points for me in my faith is going, well, actually, what is the fruit of what we're doing? Yes, there's some really good stuff, but there's some bits that we actually just need to prune off here. taking the lead from Jesus and going, actually, there's some bits here we just don't need. And maybe there's some bits that actually are flourishing over here that we've been trying to chop off, so.
But I think that even that view requires a certain level of humility to say that our tradition is a living tradition, that it continues to grow and it continues to change. And the parts that grow and change in ways that aren't loving, we have to prune off. And the ways that it is, we have to allow to flourish. And that takes that humility, again, to see that how you practice your faith isn't 100% right.
Yeah. I think one of the things that struck me listening to you and Pete is with that humility comes the ability to not just be waging war against people who disagree with you. That it's easy to go from this sort of fundamental belief that this is how we should be Christian, and then things shift for you and you now have a different idea, so you just wage war on the people who believe what you used to believe. What's that journey been like for you in terms of, have you felt like you need to campaign against that, or is it just about doing what you're doing and seeing what happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think it not to keep harping on these, but it's Pete talks about this a lot, that our need for certainty. And I think we got to address that. I think we have deep insecurities, we have fears. Those are the things that aren't solved or resolved by knowing more stuff. That requires the deep inner work of, what is that hole in the soul? Where does it come from? Because it manifests in lashing out when people confront me or disagree with me, or when someone threatens me unintentionally by disagreeing with my theological conviction. What is it that's going on underneath that? And again, the unhelpful, unreflective answer is, nothing's wrong. They're just wrong. I'm right, and I'm defending the right thing. Wouldn't you be mad? Like, it's a righteous anger. Like, I'm defending the truth. And in my experience, that's not true. That's a cover for deeper things going on. That needs to be addressed and figured out. And so that, for me, the letting go of that fundamentalist anger or the reactivity is more of an emotional, psychological journey than it is some intellectual journey.
Well, I feel like we could keep chatting about stuff all day, because we've just kind of scratched the surface of a whole bunch of stuff. But obviously people can interact with you through the Bible for Normal People, listening to that, the books that you've written. Oh, and also, actually, if people don't know about it, you're going to be speaking at Evolving Faith Conference later this year.
Yep.
Which is just a fantastic space. We've had Jeff Chew on the podcast, who helps facilitate that, and is an amazing human being as well. And so as we wrap up, I just want to say, thank you for your humility to wrestle with all of this stuff and then put it out there in a way that is inviting and allows people to wrestle with it too, allows people to hear stuff that they wouldn't normally hear. Because, I mean, that's a huge part of my heart, is going, hey, all the stuff that gets taught in Bible colleges or whatever around the world, a lot of it doesn't end up back in the church, back in normal people, and so you guys are doing a fantastic job of bringing some of that conversation to us normal people. And thank you for the heart that you do that with. Thank you for the way that you model the fact that we can engage scripturally, but love can be more important than facts. And so, thank you for what you're doing to bring a bit of heaven down to earth.
Thank you. And right back at you. Thank you for the humility and willing to have the conversation. I think it's just having more and more spaces where people feel not alone in these questions and in this journey. So thank you.
Hello, hello heaven. Will I hear you whisper to come near?
There was so much in that conversation. In many ways, we were just scratching the surface. But if you connected with what Jared had to say, definitely check out the Bible for Normal People and Jared's writing, and I'll put links for both of those in the show notes. A shift that I've wrestled with that Jared articulated so well is that shift from a desire to be right to a desire to be loving. And what a huge difference that can make in the world if we're prepared to even contemplate that. So Jared, thank you for who you are and for sharing a little of that with us today. Here is a blessing for you. Jared, as you raise your kids alongside your wife, may they too know without any shadow of a doubt that love matters more. And as you live that out as a family, may it both unite you and radiate from you to those who you encounter. May your books continue to shape and inspire others, whether they have stumbled across their words or whether they've sought them out, that they would know that they have the freedom to ask their questions, hold their doubts, and to even change their mind if necessary. May you and Pete continue to be encouraged and filled by the conversations that you record to present to others, that it would never be a chore but would be light and life to you both, just as it is for so many around the world. May you continue to hear stories of how your work and your commitment to what you share is making a difference in the lives of others in positive ways. And may you know that that difference that you make goes well beyond what you will ever know. And lastly, may you know you are seen, you are heard, and you are loved. Thanks to Strawn for the music and Rangi for the karakia. Join me next time when I talk to business development and impact specialist Sal Lee. Sal works with companies who want to make a difference in the world, helping them figure out the best ways that they can do that while also benefiting the business so that it's a win for everybody. We talk about so much, from business and social impact to friends with tumours and the fallout of that for friends and family, to colonisation and how that even affects how we've learnt to do business. It's another powerful conversation. I hope you'll join me. Until then, me inoi tātou.
E tō mātou matua I te rangi, kia tapu tō ingoa, kia tau mai tō rangatiratanga, kia mea te tau e pai ai ki runga ki te whenua, kia rite anō ki tō te rangi. Homai kia mātou ai nei, he taro mā mātou mō tēnei rā. Muro o mātou hara, me mātou hoki e muru nei I o te hunga, e hara ana kia mātou. Aua hoki mātou e kawea, kia whakawaia, engari whakaorangi a mātou I te kino.